Hi, welcome to Silent Film, and today I'll be talking about visual culture in America in kind of the very late 19th and early 20th century, as well as the emergence of film and the concept of cinema of attractions. However, before you listen to this lecture, go and watch the other two assigned videos, Crash Course Film History number 2 and Crash Course Film History number 3. You can access both of them on the Google Classroom site, and you watch them also via Edpuzzle. They're required as well. So I just want you to think for a minute about what you think kind of our visual experience of everyday life is like in 2021 America. What do you visually encounter in your daily life? How do you consume information visually? How are you entertained visually? Sort of what is that experience like? And then think about what you would assume the visual experience of everyday life in America would have been 120 years ago, around 1900. What do you think it was like then? And how does it compare to our visual culture and our visual experiences or not, or our visual experiences today? Is it similar or different? A little bit of both? We can talk about this more in the live class, but one thing I often point to when we discuss this in class is that the differences between 1900 and today, especially in sort of the importance of visuality and the visual crowdedness of our world and the visual franticness of our world, it's a very, very small difference between 1900 and today. If you contrast it to sort of American cultural life in the past, let's say 150 eras, to every previous era of human history. So, a lot of human history up until, let's say, the past 150 years, with the ability to replicate images through photography, replicate motion through film. It creates this fundamental difference in terms of human history. And so maybe there's something that unites us with people in 1900 in terms of the visual world they were living with, which is very, very different than 300 years ago, 400 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. I also want us to think about another difference that we often think, even in today, is such a tremendous difference. I want to think about, in 1900, the difference between big cities versus small towns. How are their inhabitants' lives different, right? That's the easy question around 1900. But how are their lives and their culture in the American context? Let's look at the same or at least similar. Right, when we think of these being culturally two very different spaces, especially with the rural maybe being, or small town being backward or outdated or not up to date. But that's not necessarily the case with what we call the modern era. I mean, if you think about entertainment culture and film as a part of mass culture, which is something we'll talk about in a minute, even in urban spaces and rural spaces, we're all watching the same movies, listening to the same music, reading the same books, following the same sports teams, right? And watching the same film, right? We're watching the same film. So the advent of film, the advent of cinema, is part of what we call the modern era in kind of global history. And what do we mean by modern era? What do we mean by modernity? How is this part of human history different than what has come before? And how does this kind of give us the context for the time period that we're looking at today, sort of the early emergence of film in the late 1890s or first century of the 1900s? So when historians talk about modernity, they're really talking about an era of human history of roughly the past 200 years, characterized by rapid changes in human life. and humans consciously, attempting to improve their life or engage in progress. I mean, sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not, but that's kind of the model. And really what it's about is the increasing role of science and technology in human life and the Industrial Revolution. So the advent of factory production, of the assembly line, of the mass production of consumer goods, science affecting human life directly, medical advances like vaccines, yay, increased sanitation, food production, health science, all of these things that have drastically transformed human life over the past 200 years with industrialization and kind of the everyday implications of the rise of science and technology. I mean, human life, most human beings' lives over the past 200 years are radically different than many humans have lived for most of the existence of humans. It also coincides with massive population growth. It took almost all of human history up until 1804 for the world's population to reach 1 billion. The next billion came just a century later in 1927. And in 2021, we're now around about 7.9 billion. The US specifically went from 3.9 million in 1790 to around 330 million today. So one of the things that defines modernity, along with sort of the rise of science and technology, the Industrial Revolution, is this massive population growth. And along with this massive population growth is urbanization, so mass migration from rural to urban spaces, and of course later suburban. This is a global phenomena over the past 200 years, with 2007 being the year globally that more people worldwide lived in cities than rural spaces with regional variations. But in the US, this actually happened in 1920. So in 1790, only about 1 out of every 20 Americans lived in cities, but 1 in 4 by 1870, and 1 of 2 by 1920, 2 out of 3 by 1960, and 4 out of 5 in the 21st century. So really, when we're talking about the birth of cinema, it's really happening at this moment where you're getting really close to more people in the US living in cities than in rural spaces, right? So what types of social, political, and cultural trends have gone with modernity, especially in the American context, because this is American history class? We can think about this era of modernity, especially the past 100 years, 150 years, being about mass politics, institutions of representative democracy, women's rights, the expansion of the franchise to various groups previously disenfranchised, the rising secularization of society, mass literacy, right? Almost everyone can read, the proliferation of mass media, right? Newspapers, and mass culture. More on that in a minute. Also, new technologies of modernity, electricity, the railroad, streetcars, subways, telegraphs, photography, the phonograph, all of these things are important kinds of aspects of daily life around the time we're talking about the rise of cinema. And so this kind of turn of the century era, the kind of late 1800s, early 1900s, it's an exciting time to live. It's an exciting time to live, right? People felt like they were living in kind of this new era of rapid change, right? But it also creates a sense of unease and instability for many people. Think about kind of the visual experiences of modern life, especially in a crowded city, right? Where you have, hundreds, thousands, millions of people bumping up against each other constantly, right? And, streetcars, trains, carriages, eventually automobiles, whizzing bicycles, whizzing past you, advertisements, billboards. I mean, first paper, but, later they become, later on, electronic. And even just the advent of electricity in cities itself, with street lights and lights shining out of houses, and just kind of densely packed people and a densely packed, fast-paced visual experience. Now, it's not quite the same in rural spaces, right? But it's still changing too, right? You're still getting street lights, and you're still getting the railroad, and you're still getting these new forms of entertainment like film. And something like film can bring that visual experience of urban life to your small town. So a lot of historians would say this modern era is an era of the primacy of the visual and the ever rapidly changing visual life of individuals, especially in large urban centers. So I want to talk just a little bit about mass culture of the late 19th and 20th century in America and the kinds of popular cultural entertainments that people were enjoying at the time that film is emerging. And by mass culture, right, this is opposed to something like a folk culture or a regional culture. This is a cultural product, a cultural experience that everyone within a society has access to and can enjoy. Well, obviously there's different kinds of discrimination and divisions, but the whole point is that it isn't just meant for the consumption of the elite or for a particular region or for a particular cultural group, right? It's meant for the consumption of everybody, and it unites people across a culture, right? We're all going to watch the same TV shows and talk about it. We're all going to listen to the same music. I mean, obviously that's fragmented some, I think, in the 21st century, but still there's a commonality of culture that unites us and that doesn't fall along, divides like class and region that culture used to for hundreds, if not thousands of years in human history. So probably the main form of mass culture, mass entertainment in America in the late 20th century and going into the late 19th century, going into the early 20th century, but really kind of the second half of the 19th century is vaudeville. So vaudeville is variety entertainment. It's live, right? It's a live performance. It's a variety show, and typically made up of a series of separate, unrelated acts grouped together on a common bill. So, if you went and saw a vaudeville show, say you lived in Kansas City in 1900, you'd go downtown, you'd go to a performance space. And of course, we're talking everything from very small kind of low-end performance spaces to very large, fancier ones. You might see performances of people singing popular music, maybe performers singing classical music, singers, dancers, comedians, trained animals, magicians, ventriloquists, strongmen, female and male impersonators. Actually a very popular category. Of course, we would use different language today, but that's actually something we talk about in another class. Acrobats, illustrated songs. So that would be essentially a slideshow, a magic lantern show, which we'll talk about in a minute. And people would sing along to the illustrations. The illustrations would sort of narrate the song. Jugglers, performances of one-act plays or scenes from famous plays. Sort of athletic spectacles, educational lectures, and after, around 1895, 1896, films. And remember, films at this point were 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20-second long. So audiences sit together and share this experience. And one performance group starts, the other one stops. Maybe there's some shifting of the audience, there's some talking, there's some eating, all this kind of stuff. But it's this constant sort of switching of different kinds of performances. And people are sharing this experience together in vaudeville, from opulent theaters to cheaply put together spaces. Vaudeville is to some extent associated more with working classes and maybe middle classes, but there is, a lot of mixing. And also too, vaudeville shows were often quite accessible to immigrant groups, maybe who didn't speak English very well and could enjoy the shows. And this is true of early film as well. So if we think, besides vaudeville, of other kinds of mass cultural experiences, these shared popular culture spaces and types of things that people consume in large numbers across the country, we could think of circuses, amusement parks, right? Sporting and leisure activities, expositions and World's Fair. These were very popular at this time. Magazines, newspapers, novels, and also incredibly important in terms of the visual aspect, advertising in magazines and newspapers, but billboards as well. So the visual life of the US kind of circa 1900, this period that we're talking about, is jam-packed and probably seems very familiar in a lot of ways. I mean, these are still the kinds of broadly the forms of entertainment that we enjoy, and is really already filled with all of these pleasurable things to look at. And we'll talk about the pleasures of looking at the end of this lecture, and the enjoyment of spectacle, the enjoyment of kind of this visual wow. And a lot of the spectacle is not necessarily about following a story or following a plot line or following the journey of a character, right? It's not about a narrative. It's about that visual wow, right? The big burst of fireworks, the really cool visual trick, right? The really awesome feat of strength, the really interesting magic trick. And short films were often about that. We'll talk about that more when we talk about the cinema of attractions. So I did mention the magic lantern, and this is actually, I just kind of want to give you a little taste of this because I love magic lanterns. So this is kind of we're going to talk about some of the precursors to film that, you know, there's already kind of this rich history of visual performance that people are consuming. And when film comes around, people were very used to seeing magic lantern shows, which is essentially a slideshow, but they were very ubiquitous. So magic lantern was created in the mid 1600s, but it's really becomes quite popular all through the 1800s and into the early 1900s. So at the time of the emergence of film, it's a very sort of long-standing and popular entertainment form. And again, it's kind of an early kind of image projector. It's a slide projector. And essentially, most of the models use painted glass plates and a light source. Later, kind of photography was sometimes used as a way an image was created, and not just painting on a glass plate. But again, it's like this early slide projector. Moving images are created through using multiple slides. So this is kind of an early way of creating a projected moving image. So you would have one slide that was a stationary picture, and you would have, you know, another slide that you could move in and out, and which could be set in motion by a hand or a simple mechanism, you know, so you could kind of create the sense of movement. They're illuminated at first by candles and oil lamps, but with the invention of limelight in the 1820s, it makes them much brighter, and you're able to project to larger audiences. And then by the 1860s, you get the electric arc lamp, which is even more bright. It's later used for film projection. And so a lot of different kinds of magic lantern slideshows. I mean, you would go to a vaudeville show and there'd be magic lantern slideshows. My favorite kind of magic lantern, topic of magic lantern slides, what's called the phantasmagoria, a kind of horror theater that was popular pretty early on, the late 1700s, early 1800s, using magic lanterns, where the projectionist would project scary images on walls, on smoke, or on screens, with skeletons and ghosts and demons, and, you know, all for that sort of thrill, that pleasure of looking, the pleasure of looking at something that scares you, right? So by the late 1800s, magic lanterns are the standard part of vaudeville performances. They're often used for illustrated songs. So you would have a series of slides, as I said, that would illustrate a song and people would sing along. They're also used for theater backdrops, educational lectures, amusement parks. So magic lanterns are just one example of, you know, pre-film moving image technologies, so that when film comes along, it's not the first time that people are used to seeing moving images projected for entertainment. So the illusion of motion pictures is based on an optical phenomenon known as the persistence of vision, and it creates apparent movement between images that rapidly succeed one another. So still frames are perceived by the human brain as continuous movement. Right? So if you move still frames at a certain pace, the human brain is processing it as moving. So 16 frames per second kind of is the standard for silent film. 24 for sound film, and the persistence of vision, this kind of optical illusion that the persistence of vision creates, was actually used by kinds of optical devices prior to film. And so I'm going to show you a short video now of different kinds of devices prior to film in the 1800s that were using persistence of vision.
Inspired by Faraday's wheel, Joseph Plateau in Brussels and Simon Stampfer in Vienna invent the phenakistoscope independently of one another in 1832. Stampfer called it the stroboscope. In England, it was known as the phantoscope. This disc demonstrates continuous movement for the first time. Comparable to film because it uses minimal differences between the images to create the illusion of movement. In 1833, Horner invented the Daedaleum, later called the zoetrope or wheel of life. Here, the phases of movement are also seen in the form of an infinite loop through the slits. We see an image, then no image, and then a slightly different second image, producing the illusion of movement in the mind of the viewer. In 1877, Émile Reynaud built his praxinoscope. We see the images in the mirrors.
Of course, probably the most famous use of persistence of vision prior to the advent of film is Edward Muybridge in the 1870s, who uses multiple camera takes to capture successive photographs. And then he mounts the photos on a rotating disc and projects them with a magic lantern to create a, quote, moving picture. And the most famous one is the one that you're seeing here, which is of a horse galloping. So that's kind of a background to some of the technologies that people were used to seeing already in the 1800s in terms of moving images and using this sort of persistence of vision, cognitive quirk of the human brain. So I'm not going to go into a long lecture right now on the history of early film and the development of the film technology, because the two crash course film history videos that I assigned, as well as the episode 1 of the Moguls and Movie Star that was assigned for the readings questions, they go into them in quite a bit of detail. And so I really don't need to reiterate that. So you may just want to remember, refresh your memory a little bit here. The film emerges kind of in this context of modernity, of industrialization, of urbanization, of fast-paced urban life, of mass culture, and of all of these previous technologies that are kind of creating movement to projected images. But film, of course, when it comes along, is pretty astounding. And from about 1895 till the early 1900s, the period that we'll be looking at in the next class that this lecture is connected to, film is a new technology. So there's no set form yet, right? So early innovators that the other videos talk about, like Edison and Dixon, the Lumiere brothers, right? They are playing around with technology. They're inventing technology, right? But also, and again, I won't talk about that, but that's something the other videos talk about. But also what's being played around with is the content of early film. And that's what I'm going to focus on right now. So what was the content of early film? I mean, really, of course, you're only talking about short clips, right? 10 seconds, 20 seconds, maybe 30. That's what the technology allowed you, less than a minute. A lot of, especially Edison in the US context, is filming vaudeville acts, right? And also is filming, especially the Lumiere brothers, what the French called actualités, documenting scenes of everyday life. Remember in our first class, we watched the arrival of the train. And that's really what a lot of early film is, just sort of filming these little snippets of daily life, the actualities, or kind of filming, performance, little snippets of performance. And we'll see that when we talk about early film in our class. I also want to talk about very briefly how how the audiences experience these films. So initially, right, people would see them projected in a vaudeville theater, for example, interspersed with all of these other different kinds of live performances. That was a common way. Another way, though, a non-projected technology, which was quite popular in the US for a short period of time, the late 1800s, was the kinetoscope. So this is actually not projection. One person looking into a device. So it's peep show viewing. It's voyeuristic. It's this very individual experience. So there is kind of this interesting sort of individualistic experience with the kinetoscope of viewing. But the audience experience very quickly transitions to a shared experience with the ability, with sort of the popularity of projection and the technological advancements in projection. So by the late 1890s, watching film is a shared experience where you are collectively looking at an audience or a group at a large image being projected on a wall, right? So the projector, the audience views and participates together as a group. And initially, right, these are viewing spaces such as vaudeville and theaters that are for other purposes, but increasingly, film itself becomes an attraction that isn't necessarily connected to viewing, other kinds of performances. And so once film starts to get a little bit longer, especially, you get theaters, movie theaters that are explicitly dedicated to showing film. And that comes a little, later in the first decade of the 1900s. But I want us to think about in class what it would mean to view some of these shorts from the late 1890s, the very early 1900s. What do it mean to sort of view them through a kinetoscope? All of these machines sort of lined up in an exhibition space, and you're looking down, and it's kind of this peep show viewing, a very individual experience, very voyeuristic kind of looking through a keyhole. Versus sitting in a theater space surrounded by other people with an image projected on the wall that creates the image becomes sort of larger than life, right? Literally and metaphorically, and viewing the same thing together as a group. So one of the readings you had for today was Tom Gunning's, actually film theorist Tom Gunning's famous piece called The Cinema of Attraction. And he comes up with this term actually in the 1980s to describe early silent film. So roughly from about 1895 to 1905. And so those are the shorts that we'll be looking at for class. So Gunning defines cinema of attraction as a cinema that displays its visibility, willing to rupture a self-enclosed fictional world for a chance to solicit the attention of the spectator. So it's almost kind of like this vaudeville model of spectacle after spectacle. You're watching a little clip of this piece of daily life. You're watching a little clip of this vaudeville performer. You're watching a little clip of that, little clip of that. It's not about a narrative or a story, really. So just a little bit on spectacle versus narrative. So spectacle, attraction, as Gunning says, is emphasizing presentation over representation. So it's wowing the audience with these amazing visual feats we are seeing, right? It's a visual mode of whoa. Narrative or story is about empathizing with characters, wondering how it will all work out in the end, getting lost in the story. I mean, this is what film is about to us in a lot of ways. But what Gunning is saying, and what a lot of film theorists and historians have said, is that early film, this kind of first decade of film, cinema is about the spectacle. It's not about a story. It's about the wow. And it isn't just about sort of the wow that's on screen, but film itself, just the very technology of film, is a spectacle. It's an attraction because it's so new. People are engaged in what Gunning says, quote, exhibitionist confrontation, rather than diegetic absorption, right? They're not thinking deeply about this. They're like, oh, that's so cool. Imagine nowadays, like, putting on like the latest virtual reality technology. You don't really care if there's some story in sort of the created world that you're walking into, you're virtually walking into. It's just like, oh, wow, that's so cool. How'd they do that, right? You don't really care about the story. It's more about just the fetishizing the technology itself. And presenting audiences with radical images in motion, or what's radical to them. So the early films created by Edison and his cohorts, the Lumiere brothers, to some extent, Georges Méliès, who we'll talk about the week after next, Gunning declares one can unite them in a conception that sees cinema less in a way of telling stories than as a way of presenting a series of views to the audience, fascinating because of their illusionary power, whether the realistic illusion of motion offered to the audiences first by Lumiere or the magical illusion concocted by Méliès, and exoticism. So with that said, the act of cinema of attraction does not disappear with kind of the domination of storytelling in film. Rather, it kind of takes an undercover approach, and we can think about like moments in film where there are these kind of like, wow, how they do that with the camera, right? One option for the assignment this week, the assignment where you have to do throughout the semester, so there's two options for the one this week, but one of them is whether the cinema of attractions model has actually reemerged in the 21st century with the popularity of short videos on like YouTube and TikTok and that sort of thing. Have we gone back to some aspects of that early film model? So film from, midway through the first decade of the 20th century, so let's say 05, 06, 07 onwards, starts to pull away from this kind of cinema of attraction model. And also something we'll talk about the week after next from a theater perspective, right? So just a stationary camera looking straight, not moving, no different shot sizes, no movement, nothing like that. So that's a theater model. So it starts moving away from that and also from the cinema of attraction to more of a storytelling. We'll talk about that in a couple weeks. And, one thing to think about, not everyone is convinced by Gunning's argument. Some people say there are aspects of storytelling in this first decade of film. So when we watch some of these early films in class this week, think about both a cinema of attraction, a spectacle, and storytelling and narrative, both being present. Of course, both may be present, but which is holding the viewer's attention? Think of it less maybe as either or, but how are they working together? So in conclusion, think about visual culture and the act of looking throughout this entire class. And we talked about this in the first lecture. What is sort of the way that the visual is affecting culture, right? And what is kind of, where does the visual fit into sort of this larger moment of modernity? And film is a huge part of that. And what the act of looking does. What are the pleasures of looking? The sort of psychological term is scopophilia, pleasure derived from looking at something and or someone, right? So obviously we watch film because we enjoy it. Well, for this class, some of them you have to watch because you have to. But what is that enjoyment? And that can be a very complex, multi-layered thing to disentangle. Early film audiences took immense pleasure in the act of looking. And in this very first decade of film, it's not in the satisfaction of a good story, but the pleasure of viewing a spectacle. The modern world, especially for people at the turn of the century, last century, 1900, was full of movement and all of these kinds of new things but also instability. So many new things to see and do and experience in the late 19th century, early 20th century life. And it creates this desire to see even more, right? I want more stuff. I want more new stuff. I want more spectacle. I want more pleasure. But there's also simultaneously at this time the sense of being inundated and almost overwhelmed by new sensations and changes. Movies are a safe and controlled space to consume this modern desire for more spectacle, more visual pleasure. Film viewing is passive for the spectator in a lot of ways. You sit, and pleasure is consumed in, once you get sort of theaters, it's a safe space, right? You don't have to climb Mount Rushmore and experience all of the actual physical dangers of that. You can watch someone else do it on a movie. So film is a product of modernity. That's both a showcase of modernity. Look at all this cool stuff that we can do. And in some ways a protection against it, that you can experience sort of all of the pleasures and progress of modernity from, the safe space of your theater seat. Of course, now the safe space of your home. That's all I have for now. And we can talk about all this in class. Bye.